Hey, we're live. Hey, everybody. We're rusty. We missed the intro. We missed a week. It feels like it's been forever, but here we are, back again. What's up, everybody? It's Friday. We do this Q&A. We do this Q&A every Friday. We didn't do it last Friday. You and I were traveling. We were in San Antonio. Yeah. I was traveling in this week. Scott's traveling. Everybody's traveling. It's conference season. There's stuff going on. We're visiting clients. We're taking calls. We're on the road. We're on airplanes. I've been on a dozen airplanes since January.
Phew. Golly.
So it's busy. It's crazy. I usually make it back to this desk by Friday, but we do this show every Friday, and we take your questions. We take questions that we hear in calls. We take questions that we hear at Q&As. We take questions that we hear and see online, LinkedIn, Reddit, social media, DMs, all that good stuff. And we try to summarize it here. And given some of the drama in the space, we always do it for free. We don't charge any money for it. We try to give the information away for free because we're easy to get a hold of. And there you go. All righty. So we'll let everybody trickle in. Hopefully they didn't forget that the show exists after 1 week. But
I completely forgot to post it until about 10 minutes ago on my channel. So I'm like, oh,
should be fine. Everybody will trickle back in. All right. Quick housekeeping note. Keep up access to your SPRS account and your self-assessment score in the SPRS database. A friend of ours sent a message the other day, and they said that a client that they worked with 3 or 4 years ago got set up, got their score calculated, did their thing, never heard from them again, right? Very typical, totally fine. Yeah. Apparently during that time, the one IT person that they had left, and nobody kept up with access to the account, the score, or any of that. Something happened, score expires, it's not in there, something went wrong, and their only customer basically says, no more work for you until you figure it out. They don't know how to get in. They don't know how to do the score. They don't know what's going on. They call everybody that they ever called 3 or 4 years ago in an absolute panic because things are actually on fire. So make sure that you keep up access to that account. And if you only have one person in your organization who has the keys to the kingdom, know where the keys are in case they get hit by a bus or something crazy happens, because this is actually happening. It doesn't make the news. It never gets the headlines, but this is absolutely 100% happening. So be sure you do that. All righty, let's see here. Okay, let's see.
Is there going to be another story like last week? I was not scammed over the past 2 weeks, so that's lovely. The only story that Jacob and I have, though, is it was 30 degrees in San Antonio. We were at a manufacturing conference on a beautiful golf course.
On the Hyatt Hill Country Resort golf facility. Beautiful, 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 beautiful. Talk about a first world problem.
Oh.
There,
but it was 30 degrees.
It was 30 degrees. It was 70. It was because of this polar vortex. 70 degrees the day before we got there. 70 degrees the day after we left. And 30 degrees just inside, hand on the window, tear down my face. And yeah. Man, what a bummer. What a bummer. That's all right. We'll be back. It was a great conference. We'll talk about it here in a little bit. But yeah, it was a good time. So Daniel, let's jump into your week in review like we normally do. Very interesting thread on Reddit. We actually have quite a few questions that popped up in Reddit over the last week or so. The struggle to find compliant subcontractors.
Yeah, so I'm going to pull this up. Or you have the Reddit post, Jacob?
Let me see if I can find it.
If not, I got it right here, actually. All right. So the post here was pretty interesting. Struggling to find compliant subcontractors. Basically, how is everybody handling this? We've been talking about this for a little while now. It's really becoming more and more of an issue because a lot of primes that we talk to are just now getting compliant themselves, right? And so no one in their organization seems to have been thinking about the whole supply chain component of the flow down and the requirement there, right? The risk it poses to their organization. So these are becoming more and more common questions that we're getting. There was a comment at the very top here, an upvoted comment. There's a few different ways to do it, which I love these. Eliminate CUI from the supplier relationship, right? It's like, okay, well, let's actually maybe not flow down everything like we traditionally have been doing. Let's actually be a little bit more methodical so that way we don't bring our whole supply chain into scope for CUI. That's a genius idea, right? Provide read-only access, also a good idea. Virtual desktops allow you to leave systems out of scope, right? So if you're doing a read-only, like through a portal with VDI, then the sad news is the supplier still has to go get CMMC certified, but they're leveraging, your information systems to do that. Now that's going to be a little bit tricky if a subcontractor's servicing multiple primes, right? You can't just use Lockheed's VDI system for Boeing's work, right, to view drawings. So that could be a little bit of an issue or a nuance. And then provide paper-only access. Again, print it out, ship it. The physical media controls and physical access protection, all of that kind of wrapped around it is one thing, but you're actually starting to eliminate a lot of the controls from having to be met because they're not applicable at that point, right? If you're just doing paper, no digital transmission over a network, over email, over cloud providers, things like that. So anyways, this is very common. We're seeing this a lot. I was actually talking to a civil engineer company yesterday, a 6-person shop out of the good state of California. And they were like, they're trying to break into the market with some of the primes that we work with in the architectural engineering construction space. And this is a perfect way for them to get in. I was telling them because those suppliers are freaking out because they don't know who they can trust or who they can actually end up working with in the next 12 to 18 months or so. So anyways, really, really good feedback on Reddit. Great comment here. And if you need some help with your supply chain, feel free to reach out to us. We're standing up a supply chain program where we're doing education for people's supply chains and then traceability back to who's actually watched and listened to the content around CMMC and getting compliant and things of that nature. So,
yeah. For Nelson, this is the CMMC subreddit, so r/CMMC. But
right
it's interesting in that thread. I kind of went back and forth with somebody in there because they were like, well, no one needs level 2 yet. And I was like, all right, yes, that is correct, right? There is no contractual requirement for you to have a CMMC level 2 certification. But like we've talked about a million times, as you can see in this thread, companies are looking for subcontractors who are ready to go, right? This is why waiting until it shows up in a solicitation is waiting too long, because they're saying we need to know now. This is like a very small example of what the larger primes are doing. They need to know now if companies are ready to handle the work in the future, because if they don't know, then their uncertainty and risk is through the roof. So you can do this whole thing where you're like, well, DFARS 7012 is what you have to be compliant with, and there's a POAM loophole in DFARS 7012. So you don't technically have to implement anything. You can just say, we have everything on a POAM. That's exactly the reason why the CMMC program was created, was because you could just sort of, spam the POAM loophole forever. But you're missing the bigger trend that's happening here. If you're like, well, nobody needs level 2, and the semantics of like, well, it isn't required just yet, disregards the lead time necessary to being ready on time, which, as you have said, Daniel, you can't be on time when it comes to this stuff. You have to be early, as evidenced by what's going on in this thread, or you're going to be very late. And this thread is just one of those small indicators of what's happening in the ecosystem.
Which this is an interesting comment as well. Dano Dog. Yeah, but you can't force leadership to understand. You need to do it now. No matter how much you try to educate them, they come back. It is not in my contract. I don't have to do it. And this is a sign of a sinking ship. So we use the lifeboat analogy all the time. There's only going to be so many lifeboats of organizations actually help you get compliant and then go get certified. If your leadership is saying that, they are right today in the sense of you don't have to go pursue a certification. We're seeing primes talking to their subs requiring a certification, so they have CUI on their side, and it's a private contract. They can demand whatever they want out of you if they want to keep working with you. So I'm with you, Dano Dog. It's one of those things where you've probably tried to push that boulder up a hill 10,000 times around this is coming, this is coming, this is coming. My recommendation, as we get closer and closer to this being more of a reality where it is in solicitations when 48 CFR drops, is you probably need to pull the parachute, update the LinkedIn profile and resume, and look for an organization that's going to take it seriously. So I have a lot of empathy for you because I talk to people every single day in your same situation.
Yep. It reminds me of that phenomenon where when an emergency happens, everybody doesn't all run at once. a few people start running, and then there's like a distribution of how quickly people recognize the situation and start to run away from danger. And we primarily have worked with early adopters over the last several years who see the writing on the wall and what's going on, but that's not the majority of people at all. Like we heard on a call just this week, company reached out to us because they were like, we're really surprised at what's going on, because we reach out to some of our customers who do 100% DoD work and they've done nothing. And we reach out to some of our customers who sometimes only do partial DoD work, and they're like, we're prepping for level 3 because we want to snap all this work up. But that never gets it into the headlines or anything like that. And people typically don't tip their hand about their strategy. So we're pulling the rubber band as far back as it can go on this situation. Quick question, Dano, if you're still in the comments, is your username inspired by the famous Pat McAfee segment where Dan the the like 10-year-old kid called into the show to talk about how inspiring Pat McAfee was? I don't know if you've ever seen that video. It's hilarious. Look it up. Not safe for work. Anyways, let's go on to another weekend review here. Hey, everybody. I don't know if you heard the news. Katie Arrington is back.
She's back, baby. She's back.
Katie Arrington is back. And I feel like a lot of people in the ecosystem today don't know who Katie was or who Katie is. And a lot of other people maybe just forgot what it was like when Katie Arrington was at the helm of CMMC circa 2019 through 2020, early 2022-ish. So Katie Arrington was the face of CMMC. And I did this early on. Most people did this early on. Katie Arrington was unlike any other person in the DoD ecosystem at getting on stage and absolutely getting in people's face, knocking your Cheerios off the table, slapping your phone out of your hand, and being like, this is not a joke, right? If you don't comply with these requirements, we're not doing business with you, period. And the people that she was mimicking, the energy that she was showing up to these conferences with, she was not an anomaly, right? Secretary Mattis, Mad Dog Mattis, and the Protecting Critical Technology Task Force, headed up by Brigadier General Murphy, were as, if not more, intense and pointed in their rhetoric about how fed up they were with companies exploiting POAM loopholes, incorrectly self-assessing and self-attesting to their compliance with DFARS 7012 for good reason. And so she showed up with that same energy and upset basically everybody. Basically upset everybody. And so what people did by mistake was they conflated CMMC with Katie, Katie's words with Katie, the requirements with CMMC with Katie. So as CMMC went under review when the administration changed over, as CMMC rulemaking was in doubt through most of 2021, as Katie, as a DoD appointee under a previous administration, moved on to do other things, people said, well, CMMC is not happening because the bad lady's not here anymore. That was incorrect. And that was primarily when we stepped in with a lot of our content to tell people, no, you don't understand. If you understand how rulemaking works, you'll see that when they announced that they were going to do an additional rule with the announcement of CMMC 2.0, it doesn't matter who is out here saying things or not saying things, because you can read previous rules and they say exactly what Katie's been saying up here. She's just more animated about it. And so that's the first time you're hearing about it. But this is an inevitability as DoD policy. And that's primarily the drum that we've been beating all along. And now here we are with the second rule that CMMC 2.0 announced in effect at the end of December. CMMC getting ready to go into contracts. Administration changes back to who was in charge when CMMC first started. And now Katie's got her job back and a promotion. So
CISO.
the CISO,
CISO.
the Chief Information Security Officer of the entire Department of Defense. So if you think that CMMC is going away, just strap in, just buckle up, and it's, I cannot describe to you how intense the average webinar or conference event was when Katie Arrington was at the peak of her powers circa 2019 to 2020, and the level of attention that CMMC had. I posted a chart. I'll find the link to it. I need to update the numbers. The 2020 CMMC rule has like 5x the number of page views of all other DFARS, cybersecurity, and CMMC rules since that time combined, because
True.
Katie got out there and gave so much attention to the ecosystem. We don't even come close to the level of attention that she generates around the issue, because people want to hear from the government. That's totally fine. But just her announcement of getting her job back as DoD CISO has like 2,600 likes, 1,000 plus comments. It absolutely mops the floor with even my most highest level of engagement posts ever, right? It's not even close. So get ready, everybody. If you don't know who Katie is, you will soon. And it's, in my opinion, the strongest unofficial signal that CMMC is not going anywhere. At this point, CMMC is more likely to expand federal wide than it is to contract in any way, shape, or form with Katie driving the boat here.
But Jacob, Doge.
Yeah. So I'll put it to you this way, right? The guy who wrote the document behind Project 2025 is not a political show. I'm not condoning or condemning the views in whatever your politics are. But the guy who wrote the document behind Project 2025, it's a document called A Mandate for Leadership. That guy's name is Russell Vogt. Russell Vogt was the head of OMB. OMB are the people who omni-domini bless every rule that comes from every agency. And during an incredibly anti-regulatory environment under the first Trump administration, under the eye of Russell Vogt, the guy who wrote the most intensely aggressive anti-regulatory philosophical document behind the movement, if you will, was in charge. And guess what rule flew through the process? Not just flew through the process as an interim final rule, was CMMC 1.0. Well, guess who's in charge of OMB again? Russell Vogt.
He's back.
Guess whose best friend is now the DoD CISO? Katie Arrington, right? Guess who's wondering where the hell their rule is and what's been going on for the last 4 years? So do not bet on that being a scenario. Look at who's getting appointed. Look who's getting put back in charge. 4 years was not that long ago, everybody.
Nope.
It's the same team. It's the same situation. It's not a thing. It's not a thing. Yeah. So Katie was probably the biggest proponent of calling it CUI of anybody on the planet. That's really where that came from. She was everywhere all the time. Some people are big fans. A lot of people are not big fans. Yeah. And I'll be honest, when she first came out, I was not a fan, right? I was like, this lady's crazy. She's getting up here. She's saying crazy stuff. I was working at the NIST MEP with small manufacturers on a weekly basis at the time. And I was like, this lady's out of her mind. And then I found the Federal Register and I read all the old rules, which was captured in the famous History of CMMC video that came out in 2021. And a light bulb went off. And I was like, oh, Katie's not saying anything that the department hasn't said before. She's just saying it loud enough for you to hear it. So
yep.
My perspective on her, the program, and everything changed in an instant. And ever since then, I've been telling people, like, you don't understand. You are misunderstanding the situation. I was doing the exact same thing. You can read it for yourself. Please just read it and you'll see what's happening. So there you go. All righty, everybody. Let's get into some questions that we had when we were in San Antonio.
All right.
Hey, Daniel, here's an easy one. How about those ERP systems, huh? So we were at a conference, the MFG conference. It's a wonderful conference. Loved it. Yeah. It was great. It was delightfully similar to CS2. And if you'd like to experience a delightfully well-run and awesome event, check out our registration code scrolling across your screen below. It's coming up in May. But we were talking to a room full of manufacturers. Yep. It's a manufacturing conference for manufacturers about stuff manufacturers need to know about. We got up there, told them what's going on with CMMC, told them what's going on with rulemaking, told them what's going on with procurement administrative lead time, cost, all that stuff. And the number one question that we got was, what about my ERP system? So Daniel, what is an ERP system and what do we do about it?
Yeah. So ERP systems, for any small, mid, even obviously enterprises are use them a lot. Enterprise resource and planning. All of the information in the organization pretty much goes in there at some point to process and produce the final product in the sense of the manufacturing space, right? Drawing schematics, quality, sales orders, sometimes invoices, right? I mean, depending on how jointed your systems are. So it's the central nervous system of your business, especially in the manufacturing space. And so there's some products out there you've probably heard of. Job Boss, ProShop's another one. There's some large enterprise ones like Oracle has its whole suite of ERP systems. Dynamics in the Gov Cloud is an ERP set of systems. The problem is the majority of the ones that small and medium businesses use, not enterprises, but small and medium, there is a void and a vacuum of compliant ERP systems. Because we've seen a lot of manufacturing, marketed ERP systems come out as we're CMMC compliant. We're NIST 800-171 compliant. We are X, Y, and Z. It's like, oh, great. And then you ask one question, and that is, but are you FedRAMPed? And these are all SaaS tools, right? Cloud service tools. And so you look in the FedRAMP marketplace, they're not in there. So you ask them, okay, well, are you equivalent? Have you gone through the equivalency? Have you had an assessment by a 3PAO? It comes back crickets, right? And so anybody on this live stream or anybody watching this clip after we produce it, be very aware that your most critical piece is probably not email. You might be able to subvert that to some extent. Your biggest concern is probably going to be your ERP system in the manufacturing space because of the lack of compliant solutions. So host it internally, host it in your own cloud that you've deployed that you have ownership over, right? But using a SaaS tool to do it that doesn't meet FedRAMP, unless you're trying to pull out all of the CUI, which could be a huge productivity hit to your organization and a lot of updated processes and procedures to have to change, whether you're doing commercial or defense related work, the recommendation is find one, self-host it, or do a migration. I mean, there's so few options out there for you guys, and that sucks, but that's just the reality of it.
Yeah, and I would say that the number of questions that I've gotten from the common ERP vendors, basically being like, "What's FedRAMP? Do I need FedRAMP? We do CMMC and not FedRAMP," is every one of them essentially, and so you cannot rely on them. They all, at this point, a lot of them know about the problem, right? And
yes.
They're waiting on CMMC to make a decision about going after FedRAMP, which is insanely backwards and upside down because the issue already exists. So we've outlined honestly a business case for them that we should have probably charged consulting money for.
We should have,
because they're taking it to their boards, but we gave that information away for free to them. And so you need to put pressure on them if you are reliant on an ERP system, because everything around your CUI data flow, your scope, your assessment, everything is going to run through that system. The number one way that manufacturers are going to fail their assessments is because of their ERP system.
Yep.
And the number 1B version is their MSP that they pick. So definitely something to pay attention to, but there's not an easy solution.
Nope.
I think the ERP systems are starting to wake up to the fact that they could be the easy solution if they make the investment. So hopefully that gets fixed pretty soon. But at this point,
I hope so. We had some really good, there were ERP vendors there that we talked to, and we had some great conversations. We're hoping to bring them across the line from a FedRAMP perspective. Because I mean, the addressable market on the business side of the house is going to be huge, especially if you consider FAR CUI in the next, 12 to 18 months. So
yeah, absolutely. Alrighty, here's a fun and timely question that I thought we had covered extensively and was no longer a question. But Daniel, can I outsource 100% of my compliance burden to an external provider? Can I just pay you money and make this problem go away so I never have to think about anything ever again?
You sadly can't. And as somebody who would love to sell you a product, if it existed, it would be me, but you just can't do it, right? I mean, people come to us, and I love our prospects, our customers, everyone that I get to talk to. But a lot of people think, especially at the executive level, that this is just something I can outsource, like an insurance policy. I can just sign a check, I'll have coverage, and then I'm done, right? And it's so far removed from that, right? The technical piece of implementing and even supporting it long-term through managed services, We can do that fairly easily, right? Within a few months, we can get you stood up and ready to go. However, the actual like culture and organizational processes and procedures that have to be changed based on either a changed data flow if you're going into an enclave, or just how you're doing business today if everything's going to be made compliant, you have to continuously reinforce that. You have to have advocates inside. You have to ensure that those things are happening the way that they're written. And, if it's just a technical checkbox, sure, we'll do that all day. If it's ongoing support and incident response, all day. But at the end of the day, you do have a level of responsibility where you have to at least probably on a weekly or potentially monthly basis do some general internal checks and validations that people are doing the things they said they're doing. Are they doing security awareness training? Has visitor management process been followed? Just little things like that. Physical access control. Do you have people, oh gosh, what's it called? Not shoulder surfing. When they sneak up behind you with your badge access, right? And so you just need to keep it as a culture internally that an outsourced consultant could never keep tabs on for you.
Yeah, well, and this brings up a related question. The short answer is no, you cannot outsource 100% of your compliance burden. So if someone is promising you a 100% solution, it should immediately set off red flags.
Red flags. Tailgating. Thank you. Aviation.
Tailgating, yeah. And the way to know, this is what we started out. The very first CS2 presentation that I gave as a Summit 7 employee was on this specific topic, right? The way that you know if somebody is promising you more than they can deliver is by knowing that NIST SP 800-171A exists, which are the verification procedures for your requirements in NIST SP 800-171. So what typically happened a long time ago, and I'm sure there will be a new wave of companies that try to get into the ecosystem once things show up in contracts, is they will say, we cover all of the requirements in NIST SP 800-171, or our solution maps to these requirements, some number of requirements in 171. And that tells you nothing of value because it doesn't tell you which of the verification procedures they solve for you. And so if you only take their word at the requirement level, you're missing the details of what you're paying for and what they can answer and what you have to answer. And what you'll find is that if they don't know what 171A is, you're taking a humongous risk, right? And you're going to end up with a ton of work on the back end, and that's not what you're paying for. The second is if they do map to 171A, you'll find that they don't actually cover what they're saying that they cover because there are questions that they cannot answer for you. The most, the easiest one, and I don't know if you've got an example slide in your magical slide deck, Daniel,
I'm sure
the basic SRM that we run with, but we map our SRM not only to 171A, but we also use a RACI matrix to show where the accountability lies and where our responsibility lies, which is why we never claim to solve for 100% of the requirements, because the easiest example is who are your authorized users? Who's authorized to deal with this information? We don't know that. We don't get to decide who your authorized users are. When you tell us who your authorized users are, we can run with the baton until we're blue in the face, do all the technical work, so on and so forth. However, all of these things that we're doing for you are dependent on management authorization decisions that you are ultimately accountable for. So can we advise? Can we consult? Can we help out? Of course. But we're never going to say that we solve that problem for you because it opens a tremendous amount of liability for us and for you. So the number one way to cut through all of the BS out there is to ask for SRM mapped to 800-171A. And as you dig into the details, you'll be like, wait. Who's the defense contractor here? If the outsourced MSP is responsible for every single authorization decision that filters into the technical configuration work, then they're the defense contractor, not you. But I guarantee you that if you take a solution like that and something goes wrong, which it inevitably will, that they're not going to pay 100% of your False Claims Act settlement. You're going to pay for 100% of your False Claims Act settlement. So if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Do you want to talk about sort of how we break down our SRM here?
Yeah. So I'll definitely talk about that. So there's kind of two pieces here. When you're looking at our share responsibility matrix, we have several different columns here. We have control, assessment, objective, Then we have if there's a policy and procedure requirement to justify or prove that control and assessment objective. We have responsibilities, which you can see also in the standard 171. Then we have a full RACI, right? Our MSP, our MSSP, and then customer, right? And what's nice about this is that in the actual real version, this is kind of a marketingified version, we put names next to people, right? Who's actually owning this on your side of the fence, right? Is John going to own it? Steve? Right? Who's actually going to do this? Because at the end of the day, you don't want to be left in the lurch knowing who has or has not done their job, right? Not just at an organizational, but at an individual level as well. One of the things that I'm seeing a lot of is what I'm calling, boomerangs, basically, where maybe it's not even boomerangs, but people that I've talked to over the years that have gone with other providers like MSPs and MSSPs, and that's great. No problem there. But I'm getting phone calls because those people are now backing out of relationships that they've had because the MSP and MSSP are backing out of doing CMMC at all. They've never developed the document that they said that they would. They've never put the tools in place that they said that they would. And now that the rubber's meeting the road, a lot of people are like, oh my gosh, I've hitched my wagon to the wrong truck situation, right? And so one of the things to be very much aware of on your contract side, if you have an existing relationship with an MSP and MSSP, I hope that you have verbiage and penalties in there around if they don't hold up their side, if they cause you to fail your assessment, which they very well could, right? What your termination and backout is if they cannot meet those requirements for you, even prior to going to an assessment. So I say all this to say, these are invaluable to have. If your provider doesn't have this and keeps promising it to you, you need to put the pressure on a little bit heavier, especially if your timing to get assessed is within the next few months. Because it takes, Jacob, it took us how long to put this together? And this is the third or fourth revision we've had of this. Yeah. I mean, probably 2 or 3 years collectively to get it to the point of where it is now.
Yeah. I mean, it translates everything that we do into the verification procedures in the language of it. The irony here about verification procedures in 171A is it's not just how the assessor knows if you've met your requirements. When you're outsourcing services, it's how you know that you're getting what you paid for. Right?
That's true.
And so the smaller you are, the more incentivized you are to rely on something like a standardized checklist to say, are you doing this? Are you doing this? Are you doing this? Are you doing this? Like it is exactly what a small business owner especially wants, and the assessor wants as well. Like you want the same thing in terms of what's going on. And so if you have somebody out there that's like, we do 100%, we do this, we do that, we support all the requirements, but they can't tell you what that looks like with a 171A detail, then it should just set off. It should just make your spidey sense go off, right? That's just what you should be thinking about there in terms of how it goes. Alrighty. Well, we keep saying this. We keep saying 171A. So let's talk about what that is real quick here, because I don't know if we've ever actually gone into this question. So 171A, the most important thing for people to be familiar with. If you open the CMMC assessment guide, you're looking at 171A without necessarily knowing it, because the CMMC assessment guide combines the requirement in 171 and the verification procedure in 171A. I've never been a fan of NIST keeping these as separate documents. There's a reason why they have them as separate documents. I don't agree. I think that it stems from the world of 853 and RMF and why they did that. I think it's poor design choice. And like we've been telling people for years, if you're on the 171 page, you can go down to the part where it says other parts of the publication, and you can click on 171A, and it takes you to an entirely different document. How do you assess the security requirements for controlled and classified information? How do I assess the requirements in 171? And so if you open 171A, you'll see that you've got the requirement, and this is the only part that's listed in 171. It's just this single line. How do you know if you have implemented it? How do you know if your IT people have implemented it? How do you know that the outsourced MSP that you're paying has implemented it? How do you know that it's working? How do you know that it's producing the thing that it's supposed to produce that you can verify? How do you know what you're getting how do you know your control environment is doing what you need it to do? How do you know that it's operating in accordance to the policies that you have set around who's allowed to do what and when and how? And so all of the requirements have these verification procedures, something called determination statements. The easiest way to think about this is is replace all these periods with question marks. You need to be able to answer all of these
Do
questions.
I have these?
Yeah, you need to answer all these questions. Are you doing this? Are you doing this? Are you doing this? Have you done this? Blah, 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 blah. The way that you answer those questions is either by looking at things and examining documentation, documented procedures, things like that, certain policies, interviewing people with relevant responsibilities and insight for this particular type of requirement, and then testing potentially the mechanisms that are used to implement this particular requirement. Some combination of examining, interviewing, and testing the relevant things in your environment to tell, can we answer these questions? In order for one of these requirements to be fully implemented and to get the points that you are calculating for your SPRS self-assessment score, or the points that you're going to get in your CMMC assessment, because there's the same scoring system, you have to answer all of the questions. If you're missing even one of the questions, you don't get the points for the overall requirement, which is why when people tell you, oh yeah, we do 3.1.1, we do 3.1.2, don't worry about it. And they don't have an SRM that says, well, actually, we do this part. You're responsible for this part, right? Well, then you're not actually getting what they said you're getting. You're not actually getting what you paid for, and you've got a bunch of other work to do. And if you don't know that until assessment time, you're going to have a serious problem on your hands. So the honest thing to do is to map services, even if it's only to one control, is to map services to these verification criteria. These aren't our verification criteria. We're not telling people that the proper way to vet other solutions is by vetting them through our criteria that we would use. That would obviously be a little suspicious. These are NIST's verification criteria. Everybody has access to them. The fun part is, prior to CMMC 2.0 documentation coming out, we were encouraging people that you have to have an SRM, because that's the only way that you can actually know. And then it became an actual requirement that you have to have this responsibility matrix that the assessors are going to look at. So that's what it is. That's why it's important. That's how you can cut through some of the issues.
One piece of color to add here, we talk to a lot of C3PAOs because we're really curious, how are things going, right? Like, we've got clients going through assessments. We just had another client get certified yesterday, which is great to say. And some of the C3PAOs have come forth and said, we can't get people out of phase one, basically the documentation collection element of it. They don't have all of this in line because some of them just don't know all the documents that they have to provide. And so I say all this to say is, like, there's people that thought they were ready, booked an assessment last year for this year, and are stalled at the very first step of the assessment process. And that's not just one company, that's a lot of companies. And so there's a real bottleneck there right now because people don't know this type of information.
The line at the DMV is not as long as it looks because half the people in the line don't have all the paperwork that they need.
We have talked to some C3POs that could start within a matter of a few weeks because they have so many people that are stuck in phase one, and they are taking a long time to get all that information together, probably because it's new information to some of them to have to get together.
The statement, there are not enough assessors and there isn't enough assessment capacity, is heavily caveated by the reality that not everybody is ready for an assessment. Period. Right? You don't have enough assessors for the total number of companies that need to go through. That is true. But it is not true that everyone signing up for assessments are ready to go. The line is not as long as it seems. So it's not as clear cut. But the beautiful thing about 171A, I'll just leave off with this. You know what's on the test. You know what the questions are at the back of the book, right? Everyone is asking the same questions. The questions that you would use to verify if the requirement is met are the same questions that the assessors are going to use to verify if the requirements are met. We know what to look at, we know what to ask, and we know what it corresponds to. Unlike assessments under something like SOC or ISO, where the questions and verification criteria are not standardized. They're just whatever's in the auditor's head. You don't know what they're going to ask you. And so it's a lot squishier. There's a lot more uncertainty. We don't have that problem. It's a double-edged sword because NIST, bunch of engineers, right? And they love their procedures and their instructions and all their stuff. And it's difficult to get through. And it's got a particular way of being written. But we know what's on the exam. We know what's on the test. You know exactly what you're going to be asked. So if you work with a provider that maps to this, that builds to this, that knows how this works, then by the time you get to your CMMC assessment, it's really kind of a formality because you already went through the process. You already know that it's true. You're verifying that it's being done rather than finding out for the first time. So there you go, everybody.
So somebody on LinkedIn, we have 2 customer responsibility matrices, FedRAMP and CMMC, 2 FedRAMP control mapping, which is based off NIST 853, which is the godfather of 171, as you always say, right, Jacob? So
that's right.
That's awesome, right? You're going back to the source of where all the 171 controls originated from.
100%. Alrighty, let's see, Daniel. This was the first question that we had in a call the other day, and they said, we don't know what's going on. We don't know what's true or not true. They went to a government event. Government speakers didn't get a lot of certainty from the speakers at the event about what was coming down the pike. They're working with customers. They're working with suppliers. They're getting varied responses of readiness from all those companies. What do? How do they know what CMMC level they're going to need?
So this is a
fun one at all.
Yeah, and this is the hard part, because we've talked about this before, Jacob. DFARS 7012 is pervasive, right, as a flow down. It's everywhere. But how do I know if this is actually going to turn into a CMMC L2 certification, right, or self-attesting? So we built this slide based off the DoD memo that I will share here as a good kind of starting point, right? So CMMC has 3 levels. Level 1 is based off of a FAR requirement, FAR 5220421, which is what they call it, the FAR 15 controls, or 17 practices under CMMC. And that's just for federal contracting information. So that's this top row right here, right? This is stuff that's not CUI, that's not classified, but not meant for public disclosure, okay? Then finally, the DoD came out with a little bit more clarity on who's going to have to require self-assessment or certification. Now, this is a little squishy, right? So this would mean you are receiving controlled and classified information. So there's 2 sides of this coin. There's everything outside of the defense CUI organizational index, as they call it. We just put category here for familiarity's sake. So basically everything not defense. And then we have this other requirement down here, which is everything that it is defense CUI. Now, Jacob, you and I have talked about this. I've talked with Ryan Bonner about this. I mean, this is probably 60, 70%-ish of the type of data that people are receiving on behalf of the DoD.
I would say it's 85% or more.
Yeah. So unless you're just a COTS provider, consumer off the shelf, right, you are likely probably going to be a level 2 certification requirement. Now, the level 2 piece you can see up here on the far right-hand column, it doesn't require, right, self-attestation doesn't require certification unless the DoD deems the data and the type of information sensitive enough to upgrade it to a certification requirement, right? So just because it's not something in the defense CUI category doesn't mean at the discretion of the contracting officer, they can't put that requirement into the contract. And so what we've been telling people is kind of a few different things, right? This is another kind of slide that we use a lot. Like the contracting officer at the DoD side of the house, right? Army, Air Force, Navy, et cetera. They're going to be setting this requirement based off the DoD memo that you just saw, right? That's going to be a requirement on the contract, either certification or self-attestation. And then that requirement is going to flow all the way down the supply chain for whoever's going to process, store, transmit that controlled and classified information. Here's one small caveat. Because anybody past the prime is going to be a subcontractor or a supplier, those are all private contracts. And you know what the prime can do? They can require you to have a certification even if they're not going to send you that data because it is a private contract. Yep. Legally, they're required to put it as a flow down if you're going to have this information. But even if you're not going to have it, they could still require you to be certified as a requirement to be a supplier or subcontractor to them. So It's this interesting dance going on of like, what's the government going to make me do? What's the DoD going to make me do? For the majority of the people we talk to who are suppliers and subcontractors, that's not the question. The question is, what is my prime going to make me do? Because they are
going to turn around right now and say, do these 853 controls.
100%.
They can ask for whatever they want. And the DoD has no privity of contract, is the term that the lawyers use. That's a contract between you and the prime. And you're often not in a negotiating position to change the details. It's not really a negotiation.
We jokingly talk about Doge a good bit on this live stream, right? But one of the things to be aware of is this process that you see here is going to greatly reduce fraud, waste, and abuse in the defense industrial base, because it's going to weed out a bunch of organizations, although well-intentioned, they don't have the appropriate and correct controls implemented to hold the data that they actually hold.
Yep. And there has never been a crisis of any kind that people saw coming from 1,000 miles away that humanity has preemptively done anything about, let alone the US Congress. This is an obvious, blatantly obvious problem. Sometimes those problems are referred to as gray rhinos rather than black swans, because it's obviously standing right there and charging at you. This is not some random event that we couldn't predict. And it will only be after the cookie crumbles that they're like, oh no, we got to do something about it. And so if you are not resilient in terms of your size and dependence on this type of work, then you are taking a massive gamble that you won't be included in the dust cloud that happens when this thing rolls out, and that you will make it through the fray and be on the other side whenever the tax breaks or assistance or whatever decision is made, if they make one at all, right? And so larger companies can kind of maybe roll the dice and weather that storm. Smaller companies cannot. So, plan accordingly.
Yep.
All righty. Let's see here. All right. We use Dropbox, Bluehost email, and QuickBooks in our environment. We want CMMC level 2. What do we do first?
Great question. So the first thing whenever I'm talking to somebody is, okay, what kind of data do you have in these platforms? Are you getting CUI via email? Are you getting it via Dropbox, right? Are you downloading it to your systems? And so if you were to assume Dropbox and Bluehost have CUI, the thing we need to look at next is, okay, do those cloud providers meet the FedRAMP requirement, right? We go to the FedRAMP marketplace, fedramp.gov. We look to see if they're listed. We look to see if the services listed cover the services that I'm using for CUI. And that's a common misstep. They'll see a logo like Adobe on the FedRAMP marketplace, but they're not tying it to the services they're using from an Adobe, for example. So let's assume Dropbox and Bluehost, neither of them, for the sake of this exercise, will have FedRAMP authorization, right? Including C through G of incident response and all that kind of fun stuff. So then we need to look at offsetting that. We need to look at the Microsoft Gov Cloud. Box has a FedRAMP Gov Cloud solution, looking to see what tools they can use, okay? For QuickBooks, and we actually come across this a fair amount, QuickBooks, for the majority of people, probably will not have controlled unclassified information in it. Most of that's going to be FCI, federal contracting information, invoice data, addresses, names, things like that don't need to be publicly disclosed, but aren't necessarily considered controlled unclassified information. So QuickBooks is usually okay to continue to use as long as you're not doing things like attaching deliverables to invoices, right? That could have CUI on them and things of that nature. So QuickBooks, you usually have some sort of bearing to be okay with, especially if you're using QuickBooks Online. QuickBooks On-Prem would be something a little bit different. And QuickBooks, by the way, breaks with FIPS validation. I don't know if they've ever fixed that or not. So that's always fun if you have a local install. But Dropbox and Bluehost, you are likely going to have to look to move away from that, right? So Jacob right now is looking up the FedRAMP marketplace, and I didn't see Bluehost or Dropbox so far, at least in your scrolling here. But the thing you guys are looking for is this fourth column over, which is high or moderate, or you might see LI for low impact. You want something that says moderate or something that says high. And then on the second and third column, it's going to call out usually the service and what kind of thing it's providing. Is it infrastructure as a service? Is it SaaS, software as a service, like Office 365? Infrastructure as a service would be like Azure, AWS, Google Cloud Platform. And to the person that just posted, the LinkedIn user here, Dropbox is not compliant, right? Trust.dropbox.com, they looked it up, doesn't actually meet the requirements that you need it to. So again, you got to step back for a second. You've got to do an asset inventory, understand what tools and systems you have. Then which one of them process, store, and transmit CUI. Then if they're a cloud provider, you've got to look at the FedRAMP marketplace, validate if it does or doesn't. And then from there, we've got to make some decisions on consolidating that CUI data and potentially migrating it out or fully removing it from those cloud platforms.
Gotcha. That was great. It's a great explanation. Well, while we're on this page, this is a question that we got. Why do we always talk about Duo? Why are we always talking about Duo? If you guys jump on a call with us and you're running through, we're trying to design solutions, figure out your situations. We're going to talk about Duo all the time. What's up with Duo?
Yeah, so interesting. Over the past few years, if you ever have met Scott Edwards, our CEO, Scott has admitted many times publicly he's fairly risk adverse when it comes to potential regulatory requirements, right? We want to build to the highest possible watermark to make sure that we are not putting people in a bad situation. So things went back and forth for a long time around security protection data needing to be FedRAMP or not. And so we end up deciding to use Duo, the FedRAMP version of Duo, to make sure that we could check that box and insulate from any potential changes in the regulatory requirements. Now, what does Duo do? Duo is a multi-factor provider that allows us to do MFA to the desktop as well as to Office 365 for Mac, Windows, Linux, servers, network appliances, all sorts of extra stuff, right? So if you're looking at the systems that process, store, and transmit CUI, and you have an executive on a Mac, you have people on a Windows computer, you have a couple developers on Linux, you're going to need some sort of multi-factor challenge to be able to check the box because CUI will end up being on those systems, right? In this imaginary example I'm giving you. So we use Duo as a holistic multi-factor solution when you have a multi-OS environment that you need to protect, assets you need to protect for CUI and CMMC.
Awesome. That was a great explanation. Alrighty, let's see here. Let me take this banner down. We had a good question in here. All right. We got cloud requirements. We got CUI in the cloud. We got FedRAMP. If I FIPS certify encrypt before I upload the data to the cloud provider, does the cloud provider need to be FedRAMP?
So this was a moment of tension at the Cyber AB town hall 3 months ago-ish, probably somewhere around there. So in the export control world, if you have encrypted data and you are possessing the encryption keys, meaning the provider that you're uploading to does not have access to the keys, then guess what? You would be okay in export control world, right? Because nobody can decrypt the data, right? Nobody has the ability. It's just garbled up ones and zeros, okay? However, on the Cyber AB town hall a few months ago, there was the same question was asked, and they were like, does this, if I FIPS validated, encrypted the data, and I possess the keys, Microsoft and AWS and Google and whoever else doesn't, does that asset come into scope from a cloud provider for CUI? And the answer given on the town hall was, it does come into scope. We stand by, and Jacob, I'm open to other feedback here. We stand by the same level of export control protection, meaning if the data is encrypted and you possess the keys, then that system would not be considered a CUI asset because it itself doesn't know there's CUI on it and has no way to read that CUI. Or do you, Jacob?
that generally is the rationale that passes. Obviously, you'll find export control lawyers out there who would argue the other side. You can always find a lawyer to argue with you. Yeah. I would expect that this is not going to come to a head until the requirements roll out for post-quantum crypto, right? Because the case that I've heard from the export lawyers about encrypted data still mattering is if you encrypt the data and then you store it in an adversarial country, it's still what's called a deemed export. And there are lots of, export control debates about whether encrypted data is a deemed export or not. That's generally not something that's going to show up in your CMMC assessment. But I would imagine that the language in export control policy around encrypted data will change in the future as post-quantum crypto becomes the requirement, because quantum computing allows you to unwind even the best current encryption standards. And so if you're using, really great cloud service in Beijing, then your pre-quantum crypto solution doesn't really count for much coming up here in the near future.
Well, and you think about this a little bit as well, right? It's like in that world, China has been collecting God knows how much encrypted data for decades from us. And once they flip the switch, and they probably already have in a quantum computing world, they can actively decrypt all of that. And because we have systems and military vehicles and missiles that we keep in service for decades, they could easily find loopholes and issues and exploit that data that maybe that's been sitting on their servers for 3 decades and they haven't been able to do anything with until quantum.
Maybe one day we can have my my beautiful and intelligent wife who does cybersecurity for space vehicles come on and talk about the concerns around post-quantum crypto in terms of space architectures. So it's always terrifying to listen to over the dinner table.
Vicky, our export control guru, by the way.
Thank
you for this. She's fantastic. Anyone who doesn't follow her, I'd definitely recommend to follow.
Absolutely. Alrighty. Well, speaking about keys, my company has one IT guy. Can Summit 7 set up an environment for us and then hand them the keys to just run everything? Is that a strategy? Would you advise that?
It is. One thing that we want to kind of understand is there's a requirement around separation of duties in CMMC and NIST. And having one person becomes a little bit of a problem because you can't really separate many duties because it's usually one person. So the recommendation would be, Summit 7 can set things up, give you the keys to drive off the lot, and best of luck to you from a project perspective. However, one thing you need to consider is somebody else internally in the organization needs to have at least some level of privilege and separation from the IT guy to maybe review system logs, right? Maybe do something else. That way you can make sure that actual control is being met. So that would be the recommendation. We can just do project work, or we can, do project work and manage services, whatever's the best fit for you guys.
Absolutely. And as far as separation of duty goes, this is actually, fun fact, this is actually the debate that our very own Caleb Leidy and I got into on LinkedIn years ago, prior to Caleb, back when Caleb was a DibCAC assessor, prior to coming on over to the winning team. The compliance man extraordinaire himself behind the scenes. We got to have him on the show more. And it came down to separation of duties. And this is something that I know Amira has had lots of debates with, going way back to the early days. The rationale for whether a control is non-applicable or not is whether the basis for the control exists or not. And so Wi-Fi protections, you don't have to turn on Wi-Fi because there's a requirement to protect Wi-Fi. That's ridiculous. If you use Wi-Fi, then there are requirements for it. But because there are requirements, you don't need to use Wi-Fi. Similarly, although a little more blurry, separation of duties. If there is not a basis for being able to separate the duties because there's only one person, you don't have to hire more people in order to separate the duties, just like you don't have to turn on Wi-Fi. So should you have the ability to separate? Yeah, you probably should. Do you technically need to do that if the basis for the control isn't there? No. Are you going to have a wonderful time going back and forth explaining the details of the philosophical underpinnings of non-applicability? No, you're going to hate that conversation. That's why we hired Caleb, is because he wanted to go into the details of these conversations, and he's helped all of our clients run through their assessments and implementations. So that's my philosophy on it. I always feel obligated to talk about it whenever separation of duties comes up, because I'm like, we don't do the same thing for Wi-Fi, but it is a little bit of a rabbit hole. So, all right, let's leave off on one Azure specific question, and then we'll wrap up for the week. We'll be back next week. Why does somebody need an Azure subscription? Like, what even is that, and why would people need it in order to play in this space?
Yeah, so most people use Azure subscriptions for chargeback, right? So you can have unique subscriptions to charge back for invoicing, permissions, role-based access control, right? So if you wanted to have levels of segmentation for different types of deployments that you're doing, right, at a subscription level, that way they can get access to the majority of the resources in that subscription. But a lot of people use that structure, especially in regulated research, for specific grants and contracts so that they understand what's actually costing them to do this work, right? So you can do what they call the credit card method, right? The pay-as-you-go method through credit cards. However, you don't end up with the same level of correlation as if you were to get traditional invoices with all the itemized resources per subscription, right? It's kind of one big bucket, if you will, more than individualized with unique permission sets on them as well.
Awesome. Alrighty, everybody. Well, that is the end of the show for this week. Check out CS2 Reston registration coming up in May. It's going to be awesome. We've actually sold out, I think, of more than half of the seats. So if you're
Awesome. I didn't know that.
trying to attend in person, make sure you register. But we have a virtual option too. If you can't make it, it's going to be in Reston, Virginia. Easy access, which I think why the initial registrations are filling up. It's like 5 minutes from the airport. You can check out our YouTube page, our LinkedIn page. Anywhere you can get podcasts from, you can find this show every Friday. You can find the podcast that we do every Thursday. We always put it out for free. We always will put it out for free. And so if you have questions or concerns or confusion, you can send us messages. You can send us an email. You go to CUIHotline.org. You can call the number and leave a message, and then we'll answer it on the air, and we can take it from there. So no travel coming up on the weekends anytime soon. So we'll be back next week, and we'll see you then. Thanks, everybody.
See y'all.